Am I being heard? Put your hands up if you can hear me. Excellent, that's fine. For many years, I regularly conducted ghost tours of Linlithgow and Edinburgh. Historic Scotland also employed me to lead night-time explorations into the dark sides of Linlithgow Palace, Stirling and Diddleton castles. I employed jumpers out, senior students from Linlithgow Academy, whom I paid to don costumes and frightening masks, and then emerge from behind dark corners and tombstones, all of which added to the experience. The stories I told and those I'll tell tonight were real, all carefully researched from the historic annals. People have believed in ghosts for thousands of years. In the book of Job in the Old Testament, we read, "Fear came upon me, and a trembling which made my bones to shake. Then a spirit passed before my face, the hair of my flesh stood up. The apparition stood motionless, for I could not discern the exact form thereof." And the best time of year for such nocturnal occurrences is around Halloween, the period called by our Gaelic-speaking forebears Samhain, when the sun vanished from the sky and the spirits of the dead were able to revisit their homes or the places where they died. It was the time when winter began, when light vanished, and a period of darkness followed, a time of great anxiety. Would the sun return or not? And today it's still the time when the boundary between this world and the next thins, and the spirits are able to pass between. I was often asked, mostly by Americans, why Scotland has so many ghosts. I explained that Scottish history was so full of horror stories that it was not surprising that such happenings occasioned a plethora of witnessed apparitions, with the spectres falling into one of three categories. Firstly, time warps, which may be happening here when I took this photo in Linlithgow Palace, that you're able to see into a split in the fabric of time and witness an event which took place many years before, often on the occurrence of an anniversary. This is what perhaps was happening here. Secondly, there are personality residues, where someone with such dynamic character and charisma in life lives on after death. Their vital energy, their soul, if you like, is unextinguished. They just cannot rest. And thirdly, and most frighteningly, there are unrequited souls, people who died in such a manner that they cannot repose in eternity. Often they're out to avenge their cruel demise. Usually they died in such ways as you cannot imagine, but tonight I will help you imagine. Take the case of a lad called James Baxter. He met his death at the hands of an occupying Cromwellian army who took over the running of the town, with the Roundhead soldiers barracked in St. Michael's Church. In the month of June 1651, the unfortunate Baxter was dragged from the palace dungeon and led into Linlithgow Cross, where he was paraded before a crowd of curious onlookers. He had previously been flogged 39 times, 3 times 13, the devil's numbers, just one short of the number of lashes thought to be enough to kill, the same number which flayed the backs of St. Paul and Jesus Christ himself. In obvious agony, James was then nailed by his ears to the wooden door of the town hall, one of the last happenings at the toll booth before it was dismantled by the Roundhead soldiers. The unfortunate young lad was then scobbit at the lugs. That is, he was slashed across his mouth from ear to ear. His tongue was then gripped with pincers and pulled out much further than is normally possible because of the scobbing, and then it was completely severed at the root. This was the tongue which had, in the market tavern opposite the cross, falsely proclaimed a toast to the rightful king, meaning, of course, the Stuart monarch Charles II, who was in exile in France. James was left to bleed out and died within a short time. Can his anguished soul be at rest after succumbing to such a death as that? The theory is that such tortured beings cannot settle. They are doomed to permanently return in spectral form, perhaps on the anniversary of their demise. James Baxter is still around. The story of another unrequited soul is recounted by the Reverend James Dobie in the 1795 statistical account. A local lad, James Crawford, while attending Linlithgow Grammar School, seen here, behind the town hall, had once been bullied, beaten and stripped of his coat. On leaving school, he joined the army and fought abroad for many years. On returning to Linlithgow, determined to get revenge, he tracked down his bully and stabbed him to death. Crawford was found and arrested on the Borough Moor, where he had been in hiding. He was tried and sentenced to death, and as an ex-soldier of the king, he was given the choice of how he would die. Crawford chose beheading by an axe, and this duly happened at the cross in front of a large audience. Dobie adds the fact that Crawford was buried in St. Michael's Kirkyard beneath a headstone that carried an engraving of the axe that was used. Before his head left his neck, Crawford swore at the onlookers, vowing to come back and haunt the townsfolk who had been responsible for his execution and who later threw his severed head into a bonfire. Ah! Now that's what we're dealing with. We know it. Let's see if we can find any further apparitions and try to explain why they cannot rest. Let's delve deeper into Linlithgow's dark past. Venturing up the Kirkgate, let's enter the garden at the back of the borough halls, the place where 1,200 Covenanter prisoners were held overnight following their capture at the Battle of Bothwell Bridge in 1679. Many died here, of their wounds and from exposure. As scantily clad and deprived of food and water, they perished. They were buried in hastily dug graves, their remains eventually mixed up with the remains of the animals which had been slaughtered here when this was the town's flesh market. I was once taken into that area by Willie Renton, town officer and halberdier, who, while tending to the garden, had come across a collection of bones near the high kirkyard wall, beneath a metal ring which was once used to tether animals and Covenanter prisoners. Willie delighted in pointing out to me which, in his opinion, were human bones and which had belonged to cattle or sheep. Willie admitted that he would never come into that area after dark, as he had heard many tales of weird sightings and ghostly wails being heard. He had once ventured in, but very quickly withdrew back to the pub. He was certain he had heard the lamenting souls of the dying Covenanters and the cries of those whose eternal sleep had been rudely disturbed. But let's take our courage in our hands and venture further into the area. In earlier centuries, the place was frequented by the town's female healers. They knew the medicinal properties of many plant species. These plants were fertilized by secretions from the scores of burials in the cemetery above. Regarded as wise women, their skills in preparing potions saw them often consulted by Linlithgow townsfolk. Their remedies used such ingredients as celandine for jaundice, cowslip for insomnia, foxglove for dropsy, goose dung to cure baldness. A mouthful of foam from around a donkey's mouth cured asthma. Nettles shoved up the nostril cleared nosebleeds. However, at times of national stress, all that changed. In periods of famine, disease, civil war, and economic dislocation, the mood changed towards those women that had strange knowledge. Increasingly, they were seen as necromancers, possessed with bizarre, outlandish abilities, more than likely disciples of the devil, able not just to cure, but to charm and enchant. We have to remember, of course, that 300 years ago, people were much less educated, much more irrational than we are today. They had no way of scientifically determining why adverse events happened. To protect themselves and hopefully ward off disaster, people believed in sorcery, in the existence of the supernatural, and many superstitions like those shown here that, of course, we would never ever adhere to. All over Scotland there were magic wells, healing pools, mysterious woods and lochs and places where lived elves, brownies, kelpies, urisks, weird creatures of the water, one of whom, according to Adam Dawson in his book Rambling Recollections, was believed to inhabit Linlithgow Loch. In order to protect oneself from such forces, a variety of methods were used and fervently believed in. Magic charms, lucky nails or horseshoes, and other amulets were carried. No one would dare visit Binney Craig, for example, without carrying St. John's wort, St. Columba's blessed flower, as the place was a known haunt of fairies. And there were many such beliefs. A silver coin in the hand of a sleeping baby would prevent evil spirits carrying the child away and putting a changeling, an elf child, in its place. Many folk planted rowan trees outside their homes, where the bright red berries warded off evil, usually in the form of a witch or a so-called wise woman. While previously the wise woman's ability to create sleep tinctures and love potions had been avidly sought after, in times of uncertainty, the authorities used such abilities against those women and declared them as possessed. And that's all it took. Once a woman was accused of witchcraft, it was the duty of the authorities to inspect her, following the dictates of the Bible. One such unfortunate was Linlithgow girl Isabel Haldane, accused of prophesying and sorcery. Several men swore that she had enchanted them, bewitched by her promise of providing a love potion concocted from the datura plant, a species of deadly nightshade, and guaranteed to make any woman swoon into the provider's arms. We now know that datura does contain scopolamine and atropine, both of which can cause acquiescence and hallucinations. And those women so affected were summoned as witnesses against the accused witch. Some spoke of feeling very unwell after drinking a concoction provided by her suitor. A few testified that Isabel Haldane had given them instructions on how to divine who their husband would be. The directives involved the young lady fasting all day and then at night grabbing an apple without looking at it, remembering how Eve was tempted. Instead, she had to stand naked, looking into a mirror, and peel the apple behind her head, making sure to keep the peel in one long, unbroken strip. The skin was then to be dropped over the girl's left shoulder, whereupon on landing, it would fall into the shape of a letter. The young lady was to think of two men she knew whose first name began with the letter, and then, taking 2 pips from the peeled apple, she was to give each the name of a man she was attracted to. She was then to lick and stick a pip on each of her nipples. That pip that remained stuck the longest would reveal the name of who her chosen husband would be. All the women questioned testified, declared, of course, it didn't work. One stating that she had been mortified when her mother had entered her bedroom and saw her standing, stark naked, with a pip on each nip. The accused witch, Isabel Haldane, was taken to Edinburgh and duly examined. Tests for determining a witch included: did she have facial hair? Was one eye lower than the other? Was her reflection visible in water? Could she put her hand in holy water? Did her skin bear the devil's mark, a scar, a mole, a peculiar blemish? Isabel was stripped stark naked, the word stark meaning completely. She was then pricked with a bodkin, a long sharp needle, in order to find the devil's mark, a spot that felt no pain. Isabel failed at least one test, for she was strangled and burned on Edinburgh Esplanade, one of around 4,000 women who perished this way in Scotland between 1563 and 1736, when the laws against witches were repealed. Even then, however, many continued to believe in the supernatural, in, for example, phenomena known as ley lines. Some believe that the kirkyard of St. Michael's stands on a ley line, an invisible contour of supernatural energy, linking sites of mystic power, in this case, the Mound of St. Michael, with Cairn Papal Neolithic burial mound, Kipps Cromlech, and Iron Age hill forts in the Bathgate Hills. We are not going to test the power of ley lines in the kirkyard tonight, especially at Halloween. We are certainly not going to walk widdershins, that is, anti-clockwise, around the cemetery. It was said that when the circumnavigation was over, Satan was allowed to take possession of your soul. So even although we are not entering, we can still consider some of the strange events which have taken place in the kirkyard of St. Michael's. In 1821, two men were seen walking over the peel carrying a suspicious heavy bundle. It was the body of Benjamin Jamieson, no relation. He had been buried that very morning. By the time the hue and cry went up, the body had been loaded onto a horse-drawn cart at Fiddler's Croft and was well on its way to Edinburgh, where it was sold to Dr. Knox for the princely sum of £8. The next day, the corpse appeared in an anatomy theatre, being dissected for the general behoof of watching medical students. Such was the demand for bodies to supply the growing medical fraternity that grave robbing was soon going on all over Scotland. Many are the tales told of the nocturnal activities involved, of tunnels being dug some distance from the burial, allowing the body to be slid out sideways, of the use of wooden shovels to deaden the noise. The case is well documented of an attempted grave robbery in the year 1822. Two resurrectionists opened up a recent burial in St. Michael's graveyard and found inside the coffin the body of a young woman, Marjorie McCall. They noticed that she was wearing an expensive ring on one finger, and one of the robbers tried unsuccessfully to pull it off. A knife was produced, and he proceeded to cut through the finger, flesh and bone, and With a scream, the corpse opened her eyes, obviously awakened by the pain out of a death-like coma. The robbers beat a hasty retreat. Marjorie was rescued and lived for several years until a final burial, doubly checked, I hope. Because being buried alive was not uncommon in the past, an exhumation of several Victorian graveyards has revealed disturbing signs of scratch marks under the coffin lid. Without modern electrocardiograms or electroencephalograms, 19th century medics resorted to a variety of methods to test for life before they pronounced death. Tobacco smoke enemas were commonly employed, where smoke was blown through a pipe into the rectum to see if the corpse reacted. Another method was the use of smelling salts containing burnt deer horn. Patents were taken out for emergency release coffins or caskets with a rope attached to a bell above the burial, just in case. After one of my ghost walks into St. Michael's Cemetery, I was approached by an elderly gentleman who said he'd thoroughly enjoyed the experience, but, he asked, why did your actor, your jumper out, dressed as a minister, not jump and scare me? Did he miss his cue? I asked him to explain, and he went on, you know, the tall man in black with a white moustache and a dog collar hiding in the shadows of the porch. As gently as I could, I told him that if he saw such a character, it was not one of my jumpers out. It was either Ian Patterson playing a trick or, in all likelihood, a genuine phantom. I had a folder with me which I used to show evidence regarding some of the evening's apparitions, and on a hunch I showed him this photo on the left, one of the Reverend John Ferguson, a haunted man if ever there was. He lost both of his daughters, 10-year-old Esther, who in 1889 burned to death in the manse when her nightshirt caught fire, and Jane, who died 10 years later, drowning after falling into the frozen loch while ice skating. Due to the falling darkness, the body was not recovered until the next day, when it was dragged up with a grappling iron. I'm told that to this day, police occasionally receive reports of a girl apparently in difficulties while swimming in the loch. No sign is ever found, but it may not be coincidental that these reports are all around February the 4th, the day when Jane's immortal soul left her body and was perhaps absorbed into the icy waters. Dying with her was her fiancé, William Russell, a young lawyer in the town. Both now lie in Braehead Cemetery. William's tombstone directly opposite that of Jane's, seen on the right, in a plot later also occupied by her father, Linlithgow's long-serving minister, who died in 1913. In this letter, written to local journalist Robert Fleming, on the right, Mr. Ferguson thanks the newspaper editor for his kind words, which appeared in the Linlithgowshire Gazette. He goes on to say that he would not wish for any father to be in his shoes, and how for all eternity, his words, he will continue to lament the death of his two girls. Is he condemned to forever relive those nights when fire and then ice took his children? Let us leave the good reverend to grieve and return to Linlithgow Cross, still to this day used for large public events like the riding of the marches, classic car days, street markets, and the culmination of the Advent torchlight procession. However, it has also been, as we have heard, the scene of less happy occasions, such as in the year 1819, the public hanging of Ralph Woodness. Originally from Carlisle, he had found employment in Linlithgow as a horsebreaker and chaise driver. But Ralph fell into bad company, that of Richard Smith, a habitual thief locally known as Curly. Together one evening in June 1819, they broke into the home of merchant Adam Edgar on the east side of the cross and stole several items. However, they had been seen, and so were duly arrested and sent for trial at the High Court in Edinburgh. Woodness was found guilty of aggravated housebreaking and sentenced to be hanged to death. Curly Smith received that unusual Scottish verdict of not proven and was allowed to go free. The Linlithgow populace was not happy. They knew Smith was the real culprit, that Woodness had been taken along to do the dirty work, breaking in and bagging up the spoils. There was at that time a huge effort being made to tighten up against a wave of crime afflicting the country, which had been badly affected by years of war against France. One measure recently put into law was that a guilty party should be hanged where his crime took place, as a warning to others in the area. And so Woodness was taken from Edinburgh Tolbooth and carted back to Linlithgow. On Friday, August the 27th, 1819, he was led from Linlithgow Tolbooth towards a scaffold erected at the Market Cross. Two ladders were propped up on each side, and Woodness was made to walk under one and climb up the second. Allegedly, the origin of the superstition about walking under ladders. Only the condemned about to die did that. In Scotland, the death sentence would be read out in the court by the Dempster. It was called the pronouncement of doom. The Dempster was also the official executioner, and presiding in Linlithgow on that day was Jock Heich. As he was obliged to do, he asked Woodness if he had any last words. Usually, these included a public forgiveness for the executioner, but Woodness refused, proclaiming loudly and tearfully that he was not guilty, that he had been forced to commit the crime. The noose was placed around young Ralph's neck, and the large crowd awaited the spectacle, perhaps not so much out of a macabre desire, but more out of curiosity, as all hangings had previously taken place in the capital. This was the first to take place in Linlithgow. Looking at the shaking figure atop the second ladder, The crowd initially cheered, but then took pity. A local news sheet reported, quote, his boyish aspect and the weakness of his bodily frame meant a deep commiseration was expressed by the spectators. The article goes on, the crime was forgotten, and only the feeling of sympathy persisted. Everyone knew who had bullied the lad into committing the crime, and there was a decided groan from the large crowd when the executioner pushed away the ladder on which the young lad was standing, and Woodness swung free. The noose being positioned just behind his left ear, death was not instantaneous. The neck vertebrae were not wrenched apart. Instead, the body jerked for some time until the neck arteries were crushed and brain circulation ceased. Everyone remarked on the look of pure hatred frozen on the boy's face as he was taken down and taken away for burial, while the hangman sold off sections of the rope to those in the audience wishing a souvenir of the occasion, the origin of the phrase, money for old rope. The body was buried in unconsecrated ground in a courtyard adjoining Linlithgow prison. But Ralph did not rest there for long. There he is. Within a very short time, there were reports in the area of what was called a phantasm, a vision of a young man, his head unnaturally lolling from his neck, a look of pure hatred on his malevolent face, obviously out for revenge. Locals who came across the phantasm knew immediately who it was. They reported that their blood ran cold as they quickly ran the other way, sometimes right up Dogwell Wynd. The origin of the word Dogwell would appear to be uncomplicated. At the foot stood a water font, seen here in both of these scenes. Perhaps originally the spout was in the shape of a dog's head, thus the Dog Well. However, there is some evidence that the street was named before the well was installed and was so called after the smithy halfway up the alley. It was called the Dogwell Forge, named after a tool used by blacksmiths called a dog. And if a smith could use a dog well, he was regarded as a master of his craft. In the late 17th century, the Dogwell blacksmiths were called the Rates. One day, a member of the family, George Rate, was commissioned to dispatch an old horse, whose shoes could no longer be fastened to the aged beast's crumbling hooves. George took the poor creature to the top of the property's back rig bordering the town wall, and planned to kill it in the usual manner by bringing a pickaxe swiftly down on its skull. With the animal duly tethered, George swung the pickaxe towards the animal's head, and the animal, fearing what was about to happen, swung its head to the side, and the pickaxe embedded itself in the creature's neck. In agony, the horse lunged upward, causing the pickaxe handle to connect fully and forcibly with Rate's chin. The impact ripped the young man's head clean off and flung it over the town wall. The horse's screams were heard in the smithy, and several Rates rushed to see what had happened. They came across the mutilated corpse, but there was no sign of the head. Realizing what had happened, they made their way round the town wall to where they guessed the head had landed. There was no sign of it. The shocked family surmised that a wild dog, one of many that patrolled the perimeter of the borough, had made off with the head. It was never found, so George Rate's headless body was laid to rest in St. Michael's Kirkyard, but rest is the wrong word. The long-held belief was that a body could not be accepted into the realms of heaven unless it was complete. And ever since that day, it would seem, the severed head has tried to rejoin its body. It's been seen often, floating along what is now Union Road, its horror-filled eyes pleading for someone to bury it next to its headless body. Some have gone a little closer, but no one has dared to grasp the dreadful item and take it up to St. Michael's. All who have seen it have departed the scene fast. We are now about to leave the safety of Linlithgow's town walls, strengthened after the Battle of Flodden, where there was a great fear of an English invasion. In the 17th century, the walls served to keep out carriers of the plague. Linlithgow, being blessed with a good fresh water supply, due to the many wells along the high street, it was relatively free of the disease, but people were terrified of catching it. Any person found trying to slip in over a gap or through the wall was immediately arrested, and one such, who tried to get in, was Margaret Cook from Bo'ness. The biggest fear in Linlithgow was that people from Bo'ness posed a particular risk on account of the fact that it was a busy port, seen here, and the bubonic plague might be carried in a ship. Margaret was arrested, taken to the cross and placed in the pillory, where she was branded on each Bonesian buttock. She was then tied to a cart, flogged along the high street, and ejected out of the West Port. Other Bo'ness residents were not so lucky. Gallows were erected at the town's entry, and some inhabitants of what is now called Lower Linlithgow or Linlithgow-sur-Mer were hanged there. So as we exit the protection of the town, let's hope we don't meet the naked Margaret Cook from Bo'ness back for revenge, or indeed any avenging Bonesian. You know, when I first began looking into Linlithgow's past, I would often visit the Scottish Record Office and consult the Beveridge papers, a fascinating collection of documents relating to the town's history, collected by James Beveridge, rector of Linlithgow Academy, when it was in the building now used as the Lowport Primary. Among the many fascinating documents was a small leather-bound notebook in which I discovered an account of the mysterious happenings in Beveridge's house, Wellbank, on Backstation Road. It concerned an apparition of a female child. Although Beveridge rarely saw the white-clad girl, he was on many occasions aware of her presence. This was a solid, hard-thinking headmaster. And yet he reported that the air went cold, and sometimes he felt a tiny hand take his, or he could hear light breathing. He did his own research into the matter. It transpired that in the summer of the year 1699, a child's body had been found in a shallow grave in a copse of trees to the east of what is now called the Lermonth Ducat, on the spot where Wellbank Cottage was built in 1850. The body was in a state of decomposition, its white dress reduced to mouldering rags. Beveridge found the child had been murdered, with suspicion at the time for killing falling on an eccentric hermit living in the Teen Barn in Strawberry Bank, seen here, once used to store grain for the nearby Carmelite monastery. This character, on account of his black hooded attire, went by the name of Brother Michael. And as a result of his religious rantings around the town, he was greatly feared. The suspect was taken to the toll booth and examined under torture, the theory being that if he was innocent, God would protect him from pain. If he was guilty, he would feel the agony and confess. One such test was the trial by ordeal, whereby a metal bar was heated red hot and placed in the suspect's hands. If innocent, God would heal the consequent burns. Beveridge discovered that the poor, tormented creature had died, Brother Michael that is, while undergoing the torture, and that the authorities were duly convinced that he was guilty of the murder of the young girl. But the story did not end there. In the winter of that same year, 1699, the Baron Ross of Hawkhead decided to visit his ducat, which contained spaces for over 350 pigeons used to supply fresh meat in the colder months of the year. The Baron inserted his key into the lock of the rear entrance, but found that it was difficult to push open. Trying harder, he found that it was blocked by a small leather shoe. On the floor were scraps of clothing, a length of blood-crusted rope, and signs of a struggle. It was obvious the child had been murdered there, inside the ducat, and only two people had a key for that, the Baron himself and his keeper of the dues, Gabriel Mowbray, not Brother Michael. Mowbray was duly arrested and, faced with the evidence, confessed to strangling his daughter. He explained that several bad harvests had seen the price of food rise to such a level he could not afford to feed all his family, and he had decided to get rid of one of them, the youngest girl, the most dispensable. At Mowbray's trial, the Baron Ross was asked why he had gone into his ducat late on that fateful night. He replied he had been inquiring why pigeon meat had not been brought to his house on the High Street, but that he had also been prompted to investigate when he had experienced a weird happening. Lying in his bed, he'd been dimly aware of a strange hooded figure standing at the foot, beckoning him to follow. As he rose and moved towards it, the apparition vanished. He was busy the next day, but that night he felt the need to visit his ducat for the first time ever. Was this apparition Brother Michael, unable to rest, alerting the Baron Ross of his innocence? And is Brother Michael still around us now, when we visit the area around the scene of the crime for which he was not guilty? Is he a typical unrequited soul? Watch out for him as we head downhill under the 1842 railway line and arrive in St Michael's Wynd, named after the Linlithgow patron saint, one whose crusade against evil we could do with tonight. His recent image stands at Low Port, protecting the town against Satan's hellish legions. These converted cottages, you see, were once stables, and in them were kept two beautiful black horses. They belonged to a carter called Garvey Davy, whose special steeds were the only animals in town strong enough to pull the town's huge hearse. It would be harnessed up, and the beasts would pull the mortal remains of the occupant to St Michael's Cemetery. So familiar a sight were these magnificent creatures, fully caparisoned, walking at a stately 2 miles an hour, that it became part of local lore. Whenever anyone had been ill for a time, the word would go out, "Aye, he's no got lang. I doot but that he'll be hearing Garvey Davy's hooves the next." The sentiment increased to the extent that a local belief went that if someone suffering an illness on his sickbed heard horses' hooves, he knew that he had not much longer to live. On my ghost walks at that point, my jumpers out, high on the station platform above my audience, would knock 2 halves of coconut shells together in emulation of Garvey's horse's hooves, and I would pretend to hear nothing and express shock if any of my listeners professed to be hearing a portent of doom. One night, however, I stood in that wind, gave the cue, and nothing happened. No horse's hooves. I glossed over it as best I could, and later on asked my jumpers out what had gone wrong. They explained they had been reported to the police for trespassing on railway property at night. A constable had arrived, and the boys had some trouble explaining why they were on the platform late at night with 2 half coconuts in their hands. Most of tonight's ghosts have originated in very historical scenarios. However, there are more modern ghosts. In 1943, 3 women died following an explosion in the Nobel Works. They had been employed in fitting fuses at an exact spot now occupied by Allen Steel Asset Management. And the unfortunate women still haunt those offices. Allen himself saw a woman in a darkened corridor and challenged the creature. Surprisingly, she replied, "Excuse me," and vanished. Allen described her as wearing overalls with a scarf tied round the head. A munitionette, perhaps, who knows? What I do know is that I wish I could see Allen again. A wonderful character. He passed away as a result of the COVID epidemic. How many ghosts do you think resulted from that horrendous occasion? I wonder. Some of you may find out, so beware. I suggest you look under your bed tonight. Good night. I vanished. Did you see me vanish? Thank you very much. So I do hope that you sleep well. Can you unmute these people? There we go. Now I can hear you clapping. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Bruce.